In the last few minutes, Gerry Adams has issued a statement. He said, "My response to tonight's news is one of sadness. I regret that an unprecedented opportunity for peace has foundered on the refusal of the British government and the unionist leaders to enter into dialogue and substantive negotiations. I appeal for calm. Sinn Féin's peace strategy," went on Mr. Adams, "remains as the main function of our party. It is my personal priority," he says. "All those who made genuine efforts to build the peace process must keep their nerve in the face of predictable and hypocritical reaction from political representatives who've done nothing to encourage the risky search for a peaceful settlement. That search," went on Mr. Adams, "must be redoubled." Well, in Dublin, the Irish Prime Minister John Bruton said the bombing in London was entirely unjustified. Ken McGuinness of the Ulster Unionists said the hopes of thousands of people had been dashed by what had happened. Well, we hope to have a report from Northern Ireland very soon. But in the meantime, the Prime Minister gave his first reaction to the explosion in a written statement in which he called on Sinn Féin to condemn immediately and unequivocally those who planted the bomb. Opposition leaders were also quick to condemn the action. Politicians from all parties are suggesting the return to violence might be blamed on splits between factions within the IRA. The scaling down of security arrangements, both in the province and on the mainland, became a symbol of the ceasefire. Our Home Affairs correspondent Jane Peel looks at the task facing the security forces in the wake of today's events.
Security has been slowly scaled down since the start of the ceasefire. In March last year, the army began a phased withdrawal from Northern Ireland. They'd already replaced hard helmets with berets and removed body armour. Everywhere there began to be signs of a relaxation of controls. In Britain too, things changed. After the bomb attacks on the Baltic Exchange and Bishopsgate in the City of London, 1,500 litter bins were removed to get rid of easy hiding places. They've now returned. But the so-called Ring of Steel has remained in place, a series of road closures and vehicle checks designed to discourage the IRA. They were kept largely because the measures significantly reduced traffic. The police and the security service have done nothing to scale down their anti-terrorist work despite the ceasefire. There's always been the possibility, if not the expectation, that violence would resume. Sources at MI5 say surveillance and intelligence gathering has continued because IRA members and supporters have spent the past 17 months going about all their usual business, with the exception of planting bombs. In Northern Ireland, although some troops have moved out, they can be recalled at short notice. There'll be some relief that there was no swift and overwhelming response to the ceasefire, which might have proved irreversible. Jane Peel, BBC News.
At Westminster, the reaction of the leaders of all the main parties has been one of contempt and outrage. Paddy Ashdown said it was a grave piece of news. The IRA, he said, were acting contrary to the established will of the people on both sides of the Irish border. From Westminster, Anne Perkins.
From early evening, Westminster was awash with rumours that the ceasefire was about to end. Moments after 7, the bomb went off. The shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, Mo Moulam, heard the blast.
Yes, I heard it, as I'm sure a lot of people in London did. And throughout Britain and Northern Ireland, the reaction, I'm sure, will be the same. One of sadness at what is a tragedy for the peace process. A process that has been affected by this enormous bomb tonight that we in the Labour Party condemn completely.
And what do you make of this statement from the IRA announcing the end of the ceasefire?
I think what's important tonight is to focus on the victims' families, those people that have been injured, and then we must all keep searching for peace in the weeks and months ahead.
The Conservative Party chairman was kept in touch with developments as he prepared to give a speech to a party event in London. He was unwilling to comment directly on tonight's news.
Peace in Northern Ireland is important to everyone, and under the Prime Minister's leadership, we have been devoting great efforts with others, not only to getting the peace established, but seeking to maintain it and to develop it. That that is common ground across the floor of the House of Commons.
So therefore this is a worrying, potentially, development?
Well, when I have further information, I might then be in a position better to comment on perfectly legitimate questions, but I'm just not able at the moment to respond to them.
The Liberal Democrats leader, who brought two of the central protagonists in Northern Ireland together to his party conference last autumn, spoke tonight of the shattering of tremendous hopes.
I'm bound to say that I think this is a move which will be very damaging for the IRA itself and may even cause their division. But in the short term, the shattering of the peace that is so precious and is being built with so much blood and so much effort and so much patience and so much commitment is, I think, something which most people will greet with a sinking heart and a sense of absolute horror.
Other MPs, like the former Northern Ireland Minister Michael Mates, who's still kept up to date on developments in Ulster, agree.
It confirms what many of us feared, and that is that it was only part of Sinn Féin and IRA who was interested in trying to reach a political settlement, and that there was a section of them who were not interested in trying to go down the democratic road.
And the Prime Minister, who's in his constituency, faxed a statement within the past hour calling on Sinn Féin to condemn those who planted the bomb and renewing his call for decommissioning.
The news of the Dublin statement by the IRA and the London bombing took Northern Ireland by surprise, and there was shock among most political parties there. From Northern Ireland, Dennis Murray reports.
Tonight, Sinn Féin headquarters on the Andersons Town Road in West Belfast was dark and quiet. Sources at the very highest level in the political leadership of the Republican movement, to many the political wing of the IRA, knew nothing about the statement. They couldn't say it was true, they couldn't deny it. On a BBC Northern Ireland programme recorded before the news broke, one of those Sinn Féin leaders underlined their lack of prior knowledge. Republicans, he said, were still committed to the peace process.
I can give an unequivocal assertion that Sinn Féin is committed to the total demilitarisation of our community, the total demilitarisation. That means IRA weapons, including all the other weapons.
But the language of tonight's statement is entirely credible, in line with that used even at the time of the IRA's ceasefire. The code word that went with it, used several times recently in authentic IRA statements. Representatives of the Unionist Protestant community were aghast.
If there has been a resumption of violence, then I would have to say that it's clearly been done in order to try to prevent elections. And it is incredible that people who for the last 18 months have been telling us that they want to move into the democratic process should be resorting to violence in order to stop democratic elections.
A terrorist is a terrorist until he gives up his terrorist weapons. And none of them will give up their weapons. None of them will give up their campaign for murder they intend to murder.
We prayed that we would never go back into this nightmare. So much work has been done in the public gaze and behind the scenes to try and build this peace and to build it stronger. The people of Northern Ireland do not want this. The people of Britain must realise this is not the will of the people of Northern Ireland.
I would say that the loyalist paramilitaries will look very closely at this. I don't expect a knee-jerk reaction, and we hope that this position can be retrieved, because nobody in Northern Ireland will forgive people who initiate return to violence.
That's one of the parties representing loyalist paramilitaries. Nationalists are concerned too.
What happened in London, obviously it was the IRA who did this. First of all, I condemn what they have done. I don't know whether it's a splinter group of the Provost, I just do not know that. I'm very sorry about all of those who have been injured. Now, all of that is full stop, and then where do we go from here? That's where the blame lies.
The people of Belfast were still taking in the news.
It's very sad to think that they're going to do this and break the whole thing up. So the people are crying out for peace, and some idiots are going around doing that. I mean, sure, we'll never get anywhere. That's the thing.
I can't believe it, these bombs still going, everything's still happening. It's, I don't know, sad.
Well, I think it's terrible. People are just getting used to it. Peace and quiet after all these years. So, hope it ends as quick as it starts.
A street in a city now accustomed to 18 months of peace. A dream of a new future, for now at least, gone. The RUC says it's reintroducing security measures relaxed for the ceasefires. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Belfast.
And we're joined now, I believe, from his constituency in Kent by the Northern Ireland Secretary, Sir Patrick Mayhew. Sir Patrick, what's your reaction?
One of outrage. Here were the Republicans offered a path through to the talks which they claim they have wanted to join for a very long time. That path was by way of elections. Rather than face elections, they appear to have preferred to go back to the bomb.
Mr. Adams, only this afternoon, on local radio, called the ceasefire total and permanent. What do you make of that?
The ceasefire has been something which has never been total. We have had, throughout the whole of these 17 months, actions of great brutality and great wickedness. It has been much better than in the past 17 months, but we have always made it clear that it is not a perfect peace. We were working for that. But if anything comes out of this dreadful affair, it is the vindication of the fears of people that the refusal even to start decommissioning illegally held arms held by terrorist organizations represented and was intended to represent a threat. That threat has been now made manifest.
Is it your view that the statement purportedly coming from the IRA tonight is the authentic voice of the IRA?
We have got to examine all the evidence. It looks very unpromisingly as though it is. There is the code word that we have heard, but I don't think that this is something that should be immediately concluded. One needs to look at the evidence. But when I hear of people, Mr. Adams, calling for people to keep their heads, say that to the people, 100 we hear, who have been injured, some very seriously tonight.
But if you look at Mr. Adams' statement where he says Sinn Féin's peace strategy remains as the main function of his party, and it's my personal priority, he says, all those who have made genuine efforts to build the peace process must keep their nerve in the face of what he calls your predictable and hypocritical reaction.
I think
Does this sound to you as if the IRA is now split?
Well, let's let's just ask the question, or pose the question, which I think an awful lot of people will be asking. Did the leadership of Sinn Féin know anything about this? If they didn't know anything about it, and if it runs counter to their policy, then there should be no difficulty at all in condemning it unequivocally, as the Prime Minister has already required shall be done. If they, on the other hand, are not prepared to do that, then people will draw conclusions which are very adverse to what's just been put forward by Mr. Adams. If this really is a calculated turning of the back upon elections and on the road through to democratic negotiations which has been offered, then one thing has to be made absolutely clear. None of these relaxations that your program has already mentioned this evening has been done without keeping the opportunity and keeping the ability to put them back very quickly. And those measures will be restored if that is the advice of the Chief Constable.
But in the light...
Let one thing be perfectly clear. If this is, and we hope it is not, a calculated and a central declaration of a return to violence, then the resolution of the government, the people of Northern Ireland, the people of the United Kingdom as a whole, will be found to be not one tiny bit reduced from what it was over a very unhappy period which came to an end 17 months ago.
Briefly, Sir Patrick, would you be prepared, in the light of today's developments, to meet Gerry Adams to find out actually who speaks for Sinn Féin IRA? I think we may have lost the Secretary of State on the line, but I'm sure it'll be a question put to him a number of times over the next few days. As we've heard, the Irish Prime Minister said that tonight's bombing was entirely unjustified and that it damaged all those in Ireland and Northern Ireland working for peace. I'm joined now from Dublin by our correspondent, Leo Enright. Leo, did the explosion in London and the statement delivered by the IRA come as a surprise in Dublin?
Absolutely. A huge shock, a real tragedy. according to the Irish opposition leader, Bertie Ahern, who said he's already been in personal contact with Republican connections in Northern Ireland and also with the American administration. The statement came through to Irish television. I'm in their studios now, and it was followed by a bizarre series of telephone calls in which the alleged members of the IRA sought desperately to have their statement broadcast. They made a final phone call here as I was in the newsroom at about 6:45. The broadcast was finally made when RTE were satisfied of the authenticity of the statement at 7:02, and the bomb went off at 7:01.
Is this the IRA speaking with a united voice, or is it a faction of the IRA?
It's a question I simply cannot answer, and I suspect very strongly that very few people can. There is only one single glimmer of hope in any of this, as far as analysts here believe, and that comes in the final sentence of this purported IRA statement, where they say that the blame for the failure thus far of the Irish peace process lies squarely with John Major and his government. It's being pointed out here, and I think genuinely people clutching at straws, that the phrase the failure thus far suggests that the IRA may be holding open its options.
Do you expect the Irish government to try quickly to put the peace process back on course, or is that now going to be an impossibility?
Well, there will be an awful lot of work done in the coming days. We can be certain of that. The Irish Foreign Minister, Dick Spring, is in the air as we speak, flying back from Washington. He's due here in about an hour and a half, and I would expect high-level meetings here in Dublin tonight.
Leo Enright, thank you very much indeed. The White House said President Clinton would not be giving a statement tonight. He'd been meeting the Irish Foreign Minister, Dick Spring, today, who was briefing him on the state of the Northern Ireland peace process. I'm joined now from Washington by our correspondent, Bill Turnbull. Bill, what do you know? What's been the reaction in Washington?
Over the past couple of hours, Peter, White House officials have been scrambling to find out just what's been going on to determine whether this is a partial or a complete end to the ceasefire. We're told now that there may indeed be a statement from the White House within the next hour, but clearly this has come as a great surprise and some embarrassment to the Clinton administration, who put a great deal of effort into the peace process, particularly through the work of Senator George Mitchell. One important point. Gerry Adams had his photo taken with the President in the White House for the first time last week, bestowing, if you like, international statesmanhood on him symbolically. And I think the White House may now be re-evaluating that relationship with some concentration.
You're saying that Gerry Adams may not be a welcome guest at the White House until he makes his position on this absolutely clear.
I think it's too early to tell which way the White House is going to swing. In a sense, they've banked everything, or a great deal, on Gerry Adams so far. But even the word from one or two congressmen with nationalist and Republican sympathies this afternoon has been that it has been a great mistake for the IRA to end its ceasefire if that is what has happened. Although at the same time, they say the British government must take some responsibility as well, they say, for their delaying tactics, which made such a step inevitable. The White House will look at its relationship with Gerry Adams and with Sinn Féin and determine in the course of events whether they should stick with him or try some other path.
Bill Turnbull in Washington, thank you very much. It's just over 17 months since the IRA declared their ceasefire. The RUC said tonight that steps were being taken to reintroduce measures which had been relaxed in response to it. Our reporter Paul Newman looks back at the events of the past year and a half.
Within minutes of the IRA's declaration of a cessation of hostilities, Republican supporters celebrated on the streets of West Belfast with what amounted to a victory cavalcade past Andersonstown police station. But nowhere in the IRA statement was the word permanent used, a point put to one of the key architects of the ceasefire.
I see the statement a complete cessation of violence. Complete means complete.
The Sinn Féin president, Gerry Adams, was greeted by his supporters at a news conference to give an official response to the ceasefire. And within a week, Mr. Adams became the first leader of the IRA's political wing to meet an Irish Prime Minister. His handshake with Albert Reynolds brought Sinn Féin out of the political wilderness in the face of accusations that it was too hasty.
It's never too soon to save a life. It is never too soon to stop killing. Killing has stopped, and every day that passes, more lives are saved.
The British government responded by lifting the broadcasting ban on Sinn Féin and promised a referendum on any peace plan.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the instrument, this is the article.
Within a month, loyalist gunmen announced their own ceasefire, but there were continuing doubts among senior unionist politicians about the way events were heading.
In the statement made today, they said they got certain assurances. Who gave them these assurances? How valuable these assurances are, I do not know.
On the streets of Belfast, the change in political temperature was symbolised by the reopening of security gates on the so-called Peace Line, which separated the Protestant Shankill area from the Catholic district of Springfield. By February of last year, John Major and the new Irish Prime Minister John Bruton unveiled a joint framework document on a political settlement for Northern Ireland. But months of wrangling were to follow over the British government's insistence on linking all-party talks with the IRA decommissioning its weapons. The two Prime Ministers finally announced the so-called twin-track approach at a late-night news conference on the eve of President Clinton's visit last November. But there were still clear differences.
We see no other way other than the physical beginning of decommissioning by Sinn Féin. That was our position, and it remains our position.
A physical gesture of decommissioning of arms in advance of talks, while undoubtedly desirable, it is the position of our government that that is not an attainable objective.
Mr. Clinton's visit to Belfast was perceived as a huge boost to the peace process, putting pressure particularly on Sinn Féin to cooperate with the Special International Commission set up to look at the peace process. But when the Commission chairman, George Mitchell, reported last month, he said the government should abandon its demands for decommissioning before all-party talks began. John Major responded by proposing an elected assembly for Northern Ireland, which once again reopened differences with the Irish government, who suggested a Dayton-style peace conference. Until tonight, there was still the prospect of all-party talks by the end of this month. Paul Newman, BBC News.
And still at Westminster, a few moments ago, the Labour leader Tony Blair gave this reaction to tonight's bombing.
This is a sickening and appalling act. It has no justification whatever. I believe that Sinn Féin should condemn it and condemn it utterly if they're serious about the peace process. And this is a moment in time when I believe that all political parties and all the political leaders will stay together and work together to make sure that we put the peace process back on track, because that is the only secure future for the people of Northern Ireland and indeed for the people of the mainland of Britain.
Well, our Ireland correspondent Dennis Murray joins us now from Belfast. Dennis, you heard Tony Blair. Can anyone say tonight what's left of the peace process?
Very, very difficult to say. The IRA statement said that its complete cessation was at an end. It did not spell out what kind of a campaign it was going back to. I think you have to look at this explosion tonight. It came within an hour of the initial statement. The initial statement couldn't be really authenticated for some time after that, and clearly no time for security measures to be taken. It happened in London, not in Northern Ireland, very carefully calculated by the IRA as well. It has also to be said, I think, that the Sinn Féin leadership decided some time ago that what they would see as a military campaign simply wasn't going to work. Therefore, I think they believe there is no point in going back to it. Clearly, the IRA thinks differently. What happened tonight was cold, calculated and cynical. In IRA terms, a very successful operation.
Do you get any guidance from the security forces about whether this is the IRA speaking with one voice?
Well, it's not whether the IRA is speaking with one voice, Peter. It's really whether Republicans are speaking with one voice. Now, let's assume for a second that the IRA and Sinn Féin are entirely separate organisations. They have worked together hand in glove since at least 1986 and maybe before that on policy. Now, what you had tonight was very senior members of Sinn Féin saying they simply didn't know this was going to happen. Well, if that's the case, the IRA has not told the Sinn Féin leadership, in which case you can say now that Sinn Féin clearly does not speak for the IRA. On top of that, to have a bomb attack like this in London tonight, clearly this was planned days ago. You cannot set up an attack like that in London without pre-planning it. It has been coming for some time, and even in Dublin last Wednesday, there appeared to be no hint of this from Gerry Adams. Mitchell McLaughlin on television here in Northern Ireland tonight seemed to have no hint of it. Really, the IRA appears at this stage to have done its own thing, and Sinn Féin did not know about it.
Do you think those communities which traditionally have given the IRA the benefit of the doubt, given them tacit support, will be continuing to do so after 17 months of peace?
Very difficult to say, but I genuinely believe the reason this attack happened in London was to minimise the impact on support for Republicans in Northern Ireland. Had that bomb gone off in the centre of Belfast, the centre of Londonderry, Strabane, Enniskillen, wherever, Protestants and Catholics would have been injured. And you heard people saying all the time, no one will forgive the people who break the ceasefire. Now, Republicans will say, we've had enough, that's why they did it, it's all Britain's fault. But think again, the bomb went off in London. Republicans and the IRA clearly believe that Britain only stands one thing, and I've heard this phrase from them for years. They only stand one thing, the barrel of a gun, and what they understand best is violence in their own cities.
What was the last straw, if there was one? Could it have been that the nationalist parties last weekend all endorsed the Downing Street Declaration, leaving Sinn Féin out on a limb?
I suspect, and I'm guessing here because I don't know, because the people in Sinn Féin I've been speaking to tonight don't know either. I would guess that the last straw was almost certainly John Major, in their view, dumping the Mitchell report. That was the report on the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons. In their view, he simply dumped it and went for this elected body idea, which they simply had no time for. They believe that the British government has time and again put off the minute where it has to sit down and have serious discussions with Republicans about how to make peace. If there was a last straw, that was it.
Dennis Murray in Belfast, thank you very much. Now for today's other news. Washington is sending its special envoy, Richard Holbrooke, to Bosnia to steady the peace process, which he says is facing serious challenges. Mr. Holbrooke, who drew up the Dayton Peace Accord, has described the situation as critical. He's cutting short a visit to Hungary and heading for Sarajevo to deal with warnings from the Serbs that they might start detaining Muslim citizens. The crisis has overshadowed Prince Charles's visit. This morning, the Serbs refused to meet him.
A peace agreement in difficulty. As they awaited Prince Charles's arrival in Sarajevo, the commanders of the NATO implementation force conferred about a peace which is looking increasingly fragile. The Bosnian Serb threat, they say, is the first serious challenge.
Well, I certainly don't think we want to underestimate the dangers of this situation. As you're aware, there's a huge international machine both here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and outside, and everybody is doing their level best to try and resolve this issue.
That's the situation into which the Prince of Wales stepped. A peace in which armies have withdrawn, territory been transferred, but which is coming dangerously close to breakdown over the determination of the Bosnians and others to bring suspected war criminals to justice, and the Bosnian Serb determination to avoid any such reckoning. Prince Charles was taken into Sarajevo along what used to be the city's so-called Sniper Alley, on a day when the heavy overnight snow gave its shattered buildings a deceptive tranquility. The Prince met Bosnia's President, Alija Izetbegovic, who has been warning for days that the war crimes issue must be addressed, and who faces his own particular problems. The Bosnian alliance with Croatia is looking increasingly strained. Then the Prince was taken to the city's library, an historic building which was one of the war's earliest casualties. Its collection of books and treasures was largely destroyed. Everywhere you look, evidence of damage and loss of life.
I can only express the most appalling horror at the level of destruction, the wanton destruction, which I think is so horrifying. Not only of buildings like this, but of other people's lives.
From Sarajevo, the Prince was taken to the area of central Bosnia, where the implementation of the peace is in British hands. This NATO-led force has the manpower, the heavy armour and the will to use it, which the UN force lacked. These troops came to Bosnia with the agreement of the former warring parties. Now, one party is threatening to withdraw that agreement. Richard Holbrooke, the man who engineered the Dayton Agreement, says threats from the Bosnian Serbs will not be tolerated. He's due here on Sunday. His agreement is facing difficulties. I4 hopes he's the man to solve them. Otherwise, I4 could be entering new and potentially dangerous territory. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, Central Bosnia.
Here, the government's insisting that rail privatisation is still on course, despite the collapse of the sale of the London to Southend line. John Major dismissed the setback as tiresome and denied the timetable had been thrown into chaos. Labour said the privatisation sell-off was a shambles.
Today it was business as usual on the London-Tilbury-Southend commuter line, but behind the scenes what the government had planned as a showpiece privatisation had run into the buffers. The end came in a terse announcement from BR that the managing director and finance director of LTS were being redeployed to other duties, though it stressed they were innocent of any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, an even shorter statement from the Office of the Passenger Rail Franchising Director, Roger Salmon, said OPRAF does not expect conditions necessary for transfer to be met. Therefore, previous shortlisted bidders will be invited to re-tender. Those bidders being recontacted are Prism, a bus and rail consortium, Stagecoach and GB Railways. The government insists privatisations received only a minor setback. This morning, at a school in St Neots, where he was awarding less controversial prizes, the Prime Minister was nonchalant about what had happened.
Someone misbehaved. That happens. It's happened in the public sector. It happens in the private sector. What we're concerned about is to make sure that these are franchised to companies that are going to improve the service. That is the point. That is what's happening in the other services. It's what will continue to happen.
But at Westminster, Liberal Democrats said the incident confirmed the fatal flaw of privatisation, while Labour accused the government of breaking a pledge to MPs.
It was promised that British Rail would be allowed to bid, so we'd have a benchmark of the services we've got already. British Rail has been excluded from every bid. The will of the House of Commons has not been honoured, and what we need in this case is allow British Rail to bid. Why not?
One reason why not is that BR bids would need Treasury support. But it's also an article of faith amongst ministers that private operators like Stagecoach, the new owners of South West trains, will bring greater efficiency and the discipline of the free market to the railways. Allowing BR back in would be seen as a last resort. But the government must still persuade rail travellers, who are also voters, that privatisation's a good idea. Most have strong views.
If the government had been funding the railways properly, then there wouldn't be any need for them to be privatised. I think people believe that they need to be privatised because they've seen them being so run down.
Oh, I'll be glad if they do privatise it and do something about it.
You've got any views on rail privatisation?
That's it.
But reopening bids for the Misery line could take longer than expected, if only because bankers will now be studying the arithmetic much more closely. Christopher Wayne, BBC News.
Now back to tonight's main news, the massive explosion in London's Docklands. It happened just before 7 p.m, an hour after a statement claiming to be from the IRA, which said the ceasefire was being called off. 6 people are seriously injured. There are about 100 walking wounded. Our correspondent Valerie Jones has the latest details.
Everybody go that way, please. The explosion had caused confusion and panic. Many people were enjoying a night out in restaurants and bars. The injured had been caught by flying debris. And to add to the problems, a fractured gas main caused a second explosion.
I was on the phone speaking to one of our customers, and whilst I was actually speaking, the bomb actually went off. The entire building shook. Shelves flew off of the wall behind me that were fixed to the wall. All the drawers fell over, ceiling tiles came down, dust and debris absolutely everywhere. I staggered out of my office into our boardroom area as windows blown out. I looked out and looked round the corner towards the front of the building, and you could see it was absolutely devastated.
We were gathered in an office to the side of the building nearest the blast, and we were just concluding to retire to the pub when the whole building just shook, and the windows, we thought the windows had come in. We were covered in dust, and sort of half of us were flung to the ground. We saw some people injured, 2 or 3 people, mainly facial blood and chest. One guy had his arm, shoulder damaged by the blast or flung against something, but he walked away.
At the Royal London Hospital, 8 of the casualties were described as serious. Amongst those most seriously hurt were 2 police officers from Limehouse in East London. The police had been evacuating the area after receiving a coded warning. More than 100 firefighters are still at the scene. This was a big explosion. The blast was heard several miles away. Valerie Jones, BBC News.
Since we've been on the air, Commander John Grieve, the head of the anti-terrorist branch at Scotland Yard, has made this statement to the media.
Shortly before 6 o'clock this evening, there were a series of warnings, coded, of a recognised nature that brought the police and the emergency services here. Whilst they were clearing the scene, an explosion occurred at 7 o'clock. There have been a number of casualties. It's too early to say the precise nature of those casualties. The Metropolitan Police has never dismantled its ability to respond quickly to this kind of incident. Thank you.
A reminder of the statement from Sinn Féin's President Gerry Adams tonight. He said, "My response to tonight's news is one of sadness. I regret that unprecedented opportunity for peace has foundered on the refusal of the British government and the unionist leaders to enter into dialogue and substantive negotiations. I appeal for calm." John Major called it an outrage. "We will pursue relentlessly those responsible for this disgraceful attack," he said. Robin Oakley joins us from Westminster now. Robin, where does this leave the peace process?
Well, the Prime Minister is said by those close to him to be shocked and angry, but absolutely determined to keep the peace process going. Very difficult to see how that can be done now, because attitudes on both sides, particularly among the Ulster Unionists, will have been hardened by what has happened here. Ministers are determined that there are going to be no knee-jerk reactions. They're going to assess the situation coolly. They are still intrigued as to whether there is a splinter group in the IRA behind this or whether it is the full IRA, and they've noted the differences that seem to be opening up between the IRA and Sinn Féin. That may offer some scope for some way of taking the peace process onwards. We'll probably see a meeting in the course of this month between Mr Major and the Taoiseach, John Bruton, because they've been trying to arrange that anyway to get the peace process back, some momentum behind it. That now becomes imperative. It's crucial also that London and Dublin don't start recriminations and blaming each other in any way for what has happened.
Robin Oakley at Westminster, thank you very much.